You grew up in a musical family, I believe?
Yeah, there was always music around. In those days, there wasn't any TV, and movies were films, were kind of seldom. And again, my parents' generation was even more inclined, to sing. They saw the coming in of talkies, movies, and things. So there was still a lot of homemade entertainment. And the town I grew up in Massachusetts, was a kind of a center for all those people at that time who were going to be doing square dancing and arts and crafts and everything. It wasn't an artsy, well, I guess it was at that time. It was kind of artsy, and right up until the McCarthy era. And I remember the day that came into school, and the wonderful Mrs. Hale, who had all the rhythm instruments and always had kids making stuff in her class, was gone. And then we began to see the McCarthy hearings on TV. So there was a sense right away of music. And she gave us music lessons 2 days a week in school. That was a class. And here in the States anymore, they don't have that unless you're in someplace like up in Chicago, where the school system is like very, very intensively driven towards real values, like where Alison Krauss went to school. They taught music in that school. The public schools now they're kind of behind here. But I remember that day in the 1950s when I must have been 10 years old or 11, and the McCarthy hearings were on TV, and my parents were just outraged, and there were several empty classrooms because the teachers had been removed for being, suspected of having some affiliation with the so-called communists. But, socialism after World War II, I was born in 1942, and socialism was a real, it was about even Roosevelt, was a socialist in terms of society coming first, and even the 1960s were an outburst of, do-it-yourself socialism, communalism, and so that was going on. And along with that, when I was a kid, there was a lot of banjo picking and fiddle playing, mostly I would say by kids, older kids that were in college, and had learned this stuff. I don't know where they learned it, but they'd come out and they'd play the square dances every Friday night when I was about 12 years old, in 54. And dancing and singing was all just part of it. You had Christmas caroling at Christmas time, and recorded music was a rarity. I remember before I even bought a record, making my own records out of cardboard and making up the music for them, and using these little figurines as dressed up as like singers and with fake microphones on little cardboard stages. And one day I went up to the grocery store, and there was this record by a guy named Little Richard called Tutti Frutti, and I had been hearing music late at night out of Buffalo, New York, on a program with a DJ named George Lorenz, who was known as the Hound. And in those days, kids would make records, and they'd bring the records to the radio stations. And so he would play a lot of those records, and they became hits. Some of the doo-wop stuff, the quartet stuff. But he was into, like, as his background music was Bill Doggett, kind of jazz, R&B, organ, saxophone stuff, and he would talk it up, and you'd feel like you were listening in on a guy who was where the action was, like at some club somewhere far out on the Canadian border. And in fact, the first rock and roll show I went to, I was 14 years old, and I saw Chuck Berry. And they had all these bands, the Cadillacs, the G-Clefs, all these black groups out of Philly, young guys singing great, just super, super great singers. And years later, when I was down in L.A. Meeting with Joe Smith at Warner Brother Records, Warner Asylum, he was the DJ that night at that rock and roll show when I was 14, and I reminded him of it, and I said, I used to listen to your show all the time. I said, before that, I was listening to the gospel shows coming out of Boston. And then one day, there it was, Buddy Holly, Little Richard. It seemed like it happened overnight. And he said, yeah, the record companies all decided to go that way all at once. I said, but where did you get the great records of those old doo-wop groups? He said, DJs in those days would go out to dances and spin records, and kids would dance to the records. And then they would DJ on the radio, spin records on the radio. So they'd go out and do it in person, and, just kind of, that was part of keeping the interest alive in the music. And I asked him where he had gotten all those old 45s, that he played on the air and became such great hits, like In the Still of the Night and all these wonderful old doo-wop R&B slow tunes, because those are the ones we danced to. We like the slow ones, And he said that when he played out and did the record hops, when he played records at dances, he said kids would come up and give him records that they had made themselves. And so I was 12 years old, and I'm sorry, I was 14, and we just after seeing that first rock and roll show, I had a little band called the Cupids, and we went into this Ace recording in Boston, and for like $30, I think we recorded for an hour. We got 2 songs on tape, and we took them around the local radio stations. The DJs played them. And so we had a little local thing going on in Boston, playing the record dances, the record hops. Soon there were enough young kids, really young kids playing music that, like I think the oldest guy in the band was 16, and we were like 15, 14, maybe 16. And the one guy could drive us, and we'd all hop in. Usually the drummer, of course, had the car, and we would ride out to these gigs, and we'd play these shows. And it was the most natural thing in the world to just start strumming guitars and plug into little amplifiers, and you know what I mean. It was all about enthusiasm and excitement, and then and I'd been square dancing a year before that, but rock and roll came in, and it wasn't until I got in and started playing. I was 14, 15, 16, about 17 years old. One night we finished a dance, and we went into this area called Harvard Square over by Harvard University, and we discovered all these coffee houses, Cafe Yana, Club 47, and you'd just go around window shopping. You'd look in, and there'd be guys playing conga drums and far out bass, acoustic bass, jazz guys before their gig over across town in Boston. They'd be over there in Cambridge drinking coffee, and it just seemed to be all about the joy of it. And one night, Joan Baez was singing in this little storefront called the 47 Club, and she came out, and we played a little guitar on the sidewalk and sang, rock and roll songs. And it was, I was pretty much in awe of her, and she had such a strong presence and knew all these old songs. It turns out she had learned them from somebody, and it was magic, to hear that. And Eric von Schmidt and all these folks. Dylan would come up and come through town. I never met him at the time. But my orientation, it was like once I had started to hearing people pick acoustic guitars, it was kind of like, oh, and then I heard a record of Lightning Hopkins playing the blues on acoustic guitar, and it was like, oh, so there's something beyond Chuck Berry. There's, what I mean? Then it was Muddy Waters, and, it was so rich, all the things you could discover, because they were all alive at the time and all playing.
That's right. So what did you know it was about bluegrass music that initially appealed to you, and how accessible was that music to you in Boston?
Well, Boston, I hope my phone doesn't die. I bought this phone today just so we could talk, because my old one is going.
So far, so good.
If something weird happens, just call me back.
Will do, yeah.
Boston, in the 40s, late 40s, early 50s, was Boston was a disembarkation area for soldiers returning from World War II. And most of the soldiers, it seems, were from the South, And so there were clubs all over Boston that catered to Southern musical tastes. There was a bluegrass contingent. The Lilly Brothers from West Virginia were playing in town, playing in the hotels, playing in the hotel bars, in the ballrooms. WCOP had a radio show called the Hayloft Jamboree. And, this club called the Hillbilly Ranch is where the Lilly Brothers played, and they alternated sets with a hard electric country band. And one interesting thing was that, Jack Clement produced, he's produced a lot of people. He's done some production on Townes Van Zandt, Johnny Cash. But Jack Clement now lives in Nashville, and in those days he was playing guitar with a bluegrass mandolin player named Buzz Busby. And they were playing on the air in Boston, and I used to listen to these shows. I had no idea what it was all. It was just sort of like just there, I mean, but it certainly wasn't like Irish music or something. It was definitely, interesting music. There was a lot of picking, there was a lot of singing and great songs, harmonies. So I started liking the harmonies pretty good. And so Jack Clement, a couple of years later, produced Jerry Lee Lewis's. He rolled the tape on Jerry Lee Lewis when he sang "Whole Lot of Shaking Going On" down at Sun Studios in Memphis. And so, I mean, all these interweavings. There's Jack Clement on the radio, and I'm like a up and coming guy doesn't even know what a banjo looks like, a guitar, and I mean, I had seen a guitar, and I'm hearing this music on the radio, and then all of a sudden, I'm dancing to a tune produced by the same guy a few years later. It's Jerry Lee Lewis singing "A Whole Lot of Shaking Going On." And I met Jack later in Nashville, and just amazing guy, So bluegrass was interwoven even with the rock and roll that was coming on. I mean, in fact, I heard the bluegrass first, but, it sounded like square dance, you know what I mean? It was mostly just those kind of rhythms and things, and then rock and roll came, and then after that, I discovered kind of the acoustic side of the music after hearing Lightning Hopkins. And the first time I heard bluegrass, I believe the first record I heard was, probably Flatt and Scruggs, but I heard it live before I heard a record. I heard it in Boston in the clubs. There were clubs, coffee houses. And I used to take, my mother used to drop me at the train station out in the suburbs, and I was basically out in the country at that time, but they're suburbs now, and I would take the MTA all the way around through Boston, end up over in Cambridge, where you didn't have to be you could go into the clubs, you didn't have to be 21. So I was 14, 15 years old. I was having a ball, 16, all that time, just kind of growing into the music scene that was around me, because there was no limitation of age groups. Nowadays, you can't get into a club. I guess maybe if you're 18, but 21, I don't even know what the age is anymore. But now you couldn't get into the hardcore clubs like the Hillbilly Ranch, but that's where the real country and bluegrass was being played. But I went over there, and I got a job in the band that alternated with the Lilly Brothers. So the Rainbow Valley Boys and Sweetheart, I was a member of that band, and we would play on alternate weekends with the Lilly Brothers, and then play, local gigs. It's much like Australia, in fact. Just a sort of there's these local gigs all over the place, right? All far removed from anywhere you'd expect it to be. Up the coast, up Route 1, from Boston up to Maine, New Hampshire, Maine. All the way up to Canada. Then Hawkshaw Hawkins came and lived in Boston for a while. So all this stuff was via the radio. And then the little festival that they had in my hometown called the Strawberry Festival. They always had like an old-timey band there playing banjos and fiddles. And I was just mesmerized, the sounds that were coming out of those instruments mesmerized me. But bluegrass itself had everything in it that I wanted, which was, the blues, these haunting sort of, mythical type songs, and most of all had wonderful harmony. Had great picking. Everybody got to pick. And it was such an unusual combination of instruments, banjos, fiddles, mandolins, and dobro. But I loved the harmony singing. And in the blues, it was like young guys that were learning the blues seemed to me to be stretching the point a little bit. But, John Hammond is a friend of mine, and man, there's no better song man in the world. You could call him a blues singer or anything you want, but that man, he knows songs. You know, he's a song man. And in the end, that's what blues guys really were. Big Bill Broomsey and those guys, and Josh White. Josh White was the first guy I ever sat down with to ever learn. I mean, when I was in college, I went up to him after a show, and I said, I want to sing you a song. And he said, yeah, well, go ahead, son, you know. And I was nervous. Oh, man, I had a couple of beers, and I sang my little song. And he said, you know, that's all right, man. He said, that's good. And I said, Mr. White, how do you play the guitar without looking at the fingerboard? And he said, practice in the dark, son.
Yeah, that's I've actually spoken to Josh White Jr. and he tells the same stories. One of the most common pieces of advice he used to get from his dad was the same thing: play in the dark.
Play in the dark.
Yeah.
Well, Josh had a huge stage presence. In fact, he broke a string during the show and did the most entertaining string changing I've ever. And you know what? You've got to have that in your bag because you're going to break a string sometime.
In terms of your development as a musician, how do you look back on your time with Bill Monroe?
Well, my parents wanted me to go to school, so I went to college for a couple of years. And when I graduated from high school, I was 17. I was 18, 19, and I came back from college, took some time off, and started playing around the local clubs at that point instead of just listening. When I was, 19, 20. 21, I was playing with a great band, Bill Keith and Jim Rooney, and they're a little older than I was, and they were more adapted to playing out and a certain kind of confidence in front of an audience, and so I started playing mandolin with them because Jim played guitar and they didn't need another guitarist. And we do two guitars sometimes and things like that. But it was just great to be 19 years old and part of the musical scene, not just a listener. And Bill Keith had already worked with Bill Monroe. He was the first Yankee banjo picker, to go down there to Tennessee, and he had learned bluegrass style from Don Stover, who had worked with the Lilly Brothers, but Bill Keith had also developed this tremendous melodic style of banjo playing. And he went to Nashville and he blew everyone away and played with Bill Monroe, and then he left when Bill was going to play the Hootenanny Show, and Bill Keith felt that the Hootenanny Show, because it had blackballed Pete Seeger, again, the whole bugaboo of the lefty thing, Pinko, Pete Seeger had been blackballed as a socialist, along with Woody Guthrie. But Woody had really played his cards in a different way, and Utah Phillips told me, he said he knew Woody, and I asked Utah if Woody had ever actually become a communist, and he said, well, they courted him and they loved him, but Woody never got the paperwork done. But I thought that was very right on. So Bill Keith, I was working with those guys, and they were really great, great bunch of guys to work with. And I was the kid, of course. They were like 5 years older than me, and that. 1961, 60, 61, 62, 60, was being managed by a guy who also managed Doc Watson, a man named Ralph Rinsler, who had been a mandolin player in the Greenbrier Boys, but he had gone on. He had a really broad mind about folk music, and he was, rediscovering the Balfour Brothers down in Louisiana, and he was creating the Smithsonian Folklife Institute. Part of the Smithsonian Institution is a government-sponsored institution on America, American history, American art, American music in D.C. And Bill Monroe at that time had kind of suffered at the hands of commercialism, in that, in his refusal to give up his original vision, he became slightly, for a moment, he became an anachronism, as bands like Flatt and Scruggs and the Osborne brothers, all of whom had, one or two members that had worked with Bill as members of his Bluegrass Boys. These guys, they were all creating a very smooth bluegrass sound. And Bill became more and more angular and lone wolf, kind of high lonesome. You know what I mean? He felt like he knew where the music came from, and he knew that he had brought it forward enough for everybody else to get their start. And so there was a good deal of him being the embattled, patriarch. But at the time, Bill was 50 years old, and he had been high on the country music charts with all his songs, and rock and roll had taken over about 57, 58. And so here we are in the early 60s, and Bill Monroe he was still touring, still doing dates and still on the Grand Ole Opry. And beyond that, his music was on fire. And he had so many people come and go in his bands. Bill Keith was one of them, and he had left, as I say, when they went to New York. He just felt he owed Pete Seeger so much for bringing the banjo forward as an instrument in American culture, that he just didn't feel right playing the Hootenanny show when Pete Seeger had been blackballed. So I'm playing mandolin with Bill Keith since about 61, 62, and we're doing a lot of shows. And Ralph Rinsler, now the manager, who's managing Doc Watson as well. Are you there?
Yeah, still here.
I hope I'm not rambling too much, but
you're doing fine.
Anyway, Ralph Rinsler and Mike Seeger, Pete Seeger's brother, wrote an article on Bill Monroe, championing his legacy, because, quite honestly, he was greater than he appeared to be. His recordings were going through the Nashville Mill, and it was, once you're in the bluegrass thing, you can understand everything about those recordings. But they were being put through a kind of compression and echo chamber that didn't sound at all like the raw thing, like the Stanley Brothers or people like that were putting out. And Carter Stanley had played with Bill Monroe, Mac Wiseman, Flatt and Scruggs, Sonny Osborne, all the people that were doing something in bluegrass had played with Monroe. So what Mike Seeger and Ralph Rinsler did is they wrote an article for a magazine called Sing Out. And in that article, they presented Bill to the public. I mean, it was like a beautifully written piece. So they presented him as the father of bluegrass music, as the patriarch of bluegrass music. And from that time on, Bill began to see himself a little differently. You know what I mean? Nobody in Nashville had ever said you're the father of bluegrass music, but everybody knew it. He's kind of like the father, they would say. He's kind of like the father. But what Ralph, being Yankees, now Ralph and educated and producing records on these roots artists, Mike Seeger and Ralph Rinsler said, man, this guy is the patriarch. Look at everyone's played with him. And the endless procession of sidemen in Bill's band became a little bit more oriented towards some of the younger people. Bill Keith was and Del McCurry and Bill Keith were the first two sort of Northerners. Even if they had roots in the South, they were the first Northern young kids to go to work with Bill Monroe, to be a 20-year-old or 21-year-old. And so Bill Keith had come back, and Mr. Rinsler had decided to take Bill up into the college area of New England, but there was no money, so he brought Bill up by himself, flew him up there, and they put a band together, and they asked me to play guitar. So I started playing guitar on those 3 or 4 dates, and I learned some duets of Bill's. I listened to, those days we'd listen to tapes to see what people were doing, and we'd listen to live tapes of Bill, and I learned all his songs. I learned all the solo songs that people had been singing, and when Bill came up to New England, we did this tour, and he said I should come on down to Nashville, and I thought, I thought, am I going to question this, or so I went down there, and the first thing I noticed, of course, was his penetrating sense of time. We could lay in a structure in a song, and over it, over the structure, over the deeply embedded structure, he could create a various incredible sort of textures, and that Bluegrass wasn't just a, I could see how the recordings were missing him. Because it was there were so many layers to what he was doing, and but then once you got that, then the recordings, you could make sense of them. I meant the recordings of that time. His early recordings were superbly recorded by radio engineers, you know what I mean, and who already knew how to bring something out because they were putting it over the airwaves. So making records was just another way of broadcasting for those engineers, in the 40s. And in the 50s, I just couldn't believe how funky some of these songs, like the great hit Uncle Pen. Jimmy Martin was playing on light strings on some little old Gibson guitar because he had forgotten to bring his Martin to the studio, and it was like they weren't going to delay it. So the great Bluegrass run, the great G run on Uncle Pen, it sounds like it's played on a cardboard guitar, truthfully, It's just because, it was a chance thing. It was just a moment. He didn't bring his guitar. And Jimmy could play, when he played those runs on a big old Martin guitar, nobody could beat him, And so here's this classic moment, and it just sounds so wimpy. But it became this monster hit for Bill, Uncle Pen. So when I joined him, he was, I would say he's resting on his laurels, but he had plenty of laurels. And then when I came in the band, everybody kept saying, don't keep asking Mr. Monroe so many questions. And I said, well, that's the only chance I'm ever going to have to work with this man, And so Bill and I became friends, and I didn't pester him that much, but I was traveling with him all the time. I drove the bus. I booked the shows, actually. Yeah, well, when you're 22 years old and don't know anything, and somebody says, it'd be really great if you booked the shows. I'm like, what? So I spent all my time doing that, and it taught me many things. And I even tried, in fact, I met with Jack Clement, who had been producing Mac Wiseman, and talked to him about producing Bill Monroe, just some way of giving Bill a boost. And Jack played me what he had done with Mac Wiseman, and he just looked at me and said, you want to do that to Bill Monroe? I said, no. It would have been different. You never know, I was 22 years old. I didn't know anything.
Your career has been very much a series of different projects and different bands. Are you one that becomes restless at times if in the same situation for too long?
Well, I love sound. And I'm always working on new material. And I'll put any song in a bluegrass context and see how it feels. For the last 5, 6, 7 years, I've been working with the master guitarist Tony Rice as the Rowan and Rice Quartet, and we have two really great other members of the quartet, two ladies, Bryn Bright on bass and Bryn Davies on bass, and Sharon Gilchrist on mandolin, and we got a lot of harmony singing. So it's been a great outlet for my material, and that's the way I like to work. Whatever group I'm in, I love to feel free to bring in whatever's right, because I think there's something right for every musical occasion.
Yeah.
And if you've got you're playing with a guy like Jerry Douglas, you're just going to go in a way that brings out. That's kind of what I do. Kind of what I like to do. Is find material that brings out the best of everybody involved. And when the Iraq War started, I wrote a lot of stuff. A few of the songs appeared on the album "You Were There for Me" that we did for Rounder Records. Ahmed the Beggar Boy and Miss Liberty, and I don't know where these songs come from. It has to be said. I feel it has to be said. And, I reach a certain group of people, and at certain times the emotional connection is very strong on material like that. But truthfully, in America, this is the land of the disposable everything, and I'm not sure how long people's attention span are. Our fans, our hardcore fans, they'll never forget the songs, and one of the bands I was in that was a great bluegrass band that could innovate and allowed me to do my material was Old and in the Way with Dave Grisman, Jerry Garcia, Vassar Clemens, and John Kahn. And, that was only 5 years after I left Bill Monroe. To me, at the time, it seemed like it had been at least 15 or 20 years. It was only 5 years. I left Monroe in 67, and by the end of 72, 73, we were Old and in the Way in California. And I had been in 3 bands before. Between the Monroe band, I've been in Earth Opera with Grisman, and I was in C Train with the fiddler Richard Green, who had been a bluegrass boy, and we also did a project with Richard Green, Clarence White, Bill Keith, myself, and David Grisman called Mule Skinner on Warner Brothers.
That's right.
And so, when you're that, I don't know, man, things were happening so fast. It seemed like the turnover was fast every 2 years, because all these were young players, and record people were they didn't know. They would put anything out. In hopes that it would sell enough to be, powerful in the business. But nobody understood the music, so when you had a bunch of bluegrass players playing progressive country, bluegrass rock like Mule Skinner, the record companies were like, maybe this will sell. It wasn't like they knew, or that we knew, or anybody knew.
They wouldn't dare be so adventurous these days.
Yeah, although there are... Well, nowadays it's the time of the independent. It's like everybody's got their own record company.
Well, that's true too, yeah.
Some of the younger bands, they're making records and putting them out themselves. And, that's cool. But you could always do that if you really wanted to.
Mm.
There's this famous joke about the bluegrass band that goes in the studio and they got one reel of 24-track tape and they made 12 stereo albums, 12 two-track albums. They wouldn't even think of recording all 24 tracks for a song. They would just use 2 tracks every time they wanted to make an album. So it had this one reel of tape, and all their stuff was on this one reel. But I'll tell you one thing. The thing I notice is magic is a funny thing. It has to do with elements, and it can be all kinds of elements, time and space. But nowadays, magic is the technology. And so when you're going in and you're doing everything on digital home studio, it's like, it sounds like a photo of something. I don't know. It doesn't sound quite exactly like music, but it is music. You know what I mean? But it's just a digital rendition of music.
It's lacking.
And the clock isn't running. You're not risking anything. You've bought all this stuff. You know what I mean? And now you've got to make it work for you. That's completely different than having no money and either just scrounging together enough to record a couple of songs in a studio with an engineer where you're risking everything. There's no, you know what I mean? I think it's about risk, and risk and time and space, and the need to create some sound that's, you're going to put something on record that's going to connect with people. And nowadays, of course, it all connects with people because people love music, and it sounds like music. It's good listening. But the magic, it's so hard to predict when that magic moment will come. And I've been lucky to have been part of a lot of those magic moments. I mean, Old and in the Way, we should have been heartily spanked for not being commercially minded, because we really had a hit record. And largely, Jerry Garcia was, hugely popular, and he was a magic man. That's what he lived for. I remember coming in off stage one night, and certain members of the band were going to start going back over all that had gone wrong in the set and the sound and this was wrong and that wrong. And Garcia just looked and he said, "No thoughts." Just cleared the air of any conceptual, quicksand, and let everybody's mind just be free. And that's all he lived for, and that's what his music represented. And to go from Bill Monroe within 5 years to playing with Jerry Garcia was, you don't stop at the time and go, "Pinch me, what am I doing here?" You're just there, and you're like excited. And where Bill would try and pin things down in a structural sense, Garcia just had a lot of confidence in structure and wanted more, just wanted everybody to feel the music more. He couldn't help it. That's the way he played. And he's a strong musician. He's going to have a big sense of his musicality is going to permeate the music no matter what he does. And it was like coming home with Garcia, long solos, endings of songs. And, in the end, though, we were a bluegrass band. We didn't overdo it. We were probably the first bluegrass jam band that we had long, extensive soloing and the sense of buoyancy that bluegrass has inherent in it, and then that sense of musical freedom that comes out of the 60s from players like Eric Dolphy, John Coltrane, Miles Davis. Those guys were a big influence on how we loved music, because you could hear from those guys that there was a commitment to, let the melodic line develop in a solo, let it develop. You don't have to, pin it down to, every one of Bill Monroe's records is 2 minutes and 13 seconds. That's unbelievable. They must have edited those records. But there was a fiddle turnaround, a verse, chorus, a fiddle solo, verse, chorus, turnaround, chorus, end. And they got it all down there in 2 minutes and 30 seconds, And Old and in the Way was of the later era where Bob Dylan had been recording, 6-7 minute songs, and it was like, we had the energy, tell a story for 5-6 minutes, So we were celebrating Bill Monroe's music in the truest way we knew how.
Sure.
Yeah, it was we just loved it,
You've always kept an open mind musically. You've never been afraid to try different things. Are there any projects that you haven't tried that you'd still like to have a go at?
Well, I did a reggae project. I went to Jamaica and did a reggae project called Reggae Billy.
Reggae Billy, yeah.
Yeah, and I did some, bluegrass tunes on that. I did Little Maggie and, used some good fiddle playing and dobro and banjo playing without just trying to, you could go the other way and just, bring in some percussionists and play bluegrass, but I think reggae music is one of the great world music's tremendous heartbeat of soulfulness, and it's a spiritual music. That was satisfying. I'd like to do more of that. I've got some unreleased stuff with some Indian musicians or musicians from Nepal. I went to Nepal and the Himalayas in 1992 and went back and forth till a couple of years ago, and just every few years, every couple of 3 years, I go over there and kind of breathe an air of a culture that is so ancient and so filled with this thought of enlightenment. We're a very intellectual society, and when you talk about enlightenment, it's mostly talking about the Western Enlightenment, which was a moment in history, I guess, just after the Renaissance, But the idea of enlightenment, what the English word means, enlightenment, to be, to kind of a light going on and everything shown in its true sense. I mean, the ancient sense of enlightenment, the Buddhist enlightenment, they refer to him as the Gyalwa, the victor, who is victorious over, illusions and self-destructive self-deceptions and ego. That's been going on over there for 2,500 years, and it wasn't until Freud started, psychoanalysis, and Freud and Jung. That's recent. That's within 100 years in the West, and it was interesting to go to Asia and breathe this air of, in the Kathmandu Valley. There's been so much spiritual practice done there, with the goal of attaining enlightenment, of course, in the Buddhist sense, to attain enlightenment for all beings. And sometimes in Kathmandu, you just start giggling. You just can't help it. I mean, you giggle with this joy of like, this tradition is alive, And of course, the Dalai Lama and many, many teachers from the Tibetan mountains of the Himalayas have come over here and are teaching over here actively. I'm sorry, you're in Australia. So, I mean, they're coming to Australia too. So people are hungry for this sense of spiritual awakening, and I've written a few songs that are kind of steeped in that tradition, but I've recorded a few of them. We've got some keepers with a wonderful Nepalese flute player, Manoj Singh, and a tabla player called Homnath. And I'd like to get that project a little further along. It's just that in America, tablas and flutes, and then there's our roots. You know what I mean? To be valid to our roots. It's closer to Luther Perkins playing guitar for Johnny Cash, I mean, you know what I mean? That something calls to me out of the dark American night of it's like an old film of these old images of America, and they're really gone. Hardly anybody's going to grow up outside of the South and hear the sound of a train going by at night. I mean, you will occasionally. How many kids actually get to see a water buffalo plowing a rice paddy? I mean, it's in my mind, and probably yours too, because we've seen it. But think about kids growing up these days, what are they going to, how are they going to relate to their world if they don't ever see a field being mown, or I grew up that way. I rode on the back of a horse-drawn hay rake, and with the local guy who was working the field. And so I have this. I don't know if it's nostalgia, but this sense of something calls me. I did one album of this type of material called Dust Bowl Children, and that was on Sugar Hill in 1990, and that was from living in Tennessee and seeing the struggle of the farmers down there during this drought. I mean, the cornfields were just dried up to nothing. And then with my travels across America, I'm sort of haunted by you know, the American history, you know, the American Indian, there's something there that just keeps calling me. It has over the years for forever and ever. You know, Panama Red, Land of the Navajo. I still spend quite a lot of time in Texas, and I find there's something in the air down there that makes you compose a song. You know, and I suppose that songs originally were meant to be carried from place to place, so that it was a way of encapsulating events of the day. And I think I probably write more songs when I don't read the newspaper and don't watch TV. You know what I mean? Because then I can encapsulate my feelings better. But the media has stolen the poetic magic. Man, you have to be... You have to, I guess it was the poet Seamus Heaney. Oh, get it mixed up between Joe Heaney and Seamus Ennis. But there's, you know, the famous poet has been this Irish poet. He said the only way to accomplish poetry is by stealth and entrapment, you know, so evasiveness, stealth, entrapment. He wrote this book called The Redress of Poetry, but the Irish tradition has given us a lot, given a tremendous amount in the past 25 years, ever since these people like Paul Brady and Christy Moore, the Bothy Band, you know, they kind of showed us how they were interpreting their tradition as young players in the 1980s, and so it opened up bluegrass a lot for me. That's when I did an album called The Walls of Time, and I did an old Irish song called The Plains of Waterloo, and it was, you know, it's perfect. Bluegrass can handle all this stuff. It doesn't always have to be, you know, four-square bluegrass, you know. And so the whole Celtic connection with a poet like Patrick Kavanagh, who wrote Raglan Road, you know, I recorded that. Me and Ricky Skaggs and Jerry Douglas recorded that, and it makes an incredible bluegrass song. So what I do, I just keep my ears open, you know, and sometimes it's right for bluegrass, and sometimes it's time to be a little more adventuresome and step out into the unnameable music that just comes from your soul, you know. So this sense of the earth of America, you know, it kind of, in your mind, you kind of go, well, yeah, it's all been done, you know. I mean, you can buy the DVD or something, but not if you really go out there. If you start going out there and you start walking around in the salt flats of Nevada and go into the canyons, you know, up in Utah, and you go down into the land of the Navajo, and, you know, it's earth every step of the way, and you can only walk 1 foot at a time. But most people, we're traveling pretty fast these days. We're flying in a jet plane over all this. We don't see what's going on the ground. And but there's something still there for me to tell the story of the American world. I don't know what, it's not the American world of the urban thing. I mean, that's kind of covered. They got that covered. But it's the mythological American world, you know, where you can get to it a lot of different ways. You can get to it through roots music, you know, through bluegrass and gospel. Or you can get to it in a way that I love getting to it, is through more of a Woody Guthrie approach, you know, the balladeer approach, you know. You tell stories, you know. That really appeals to me. I'd like to keep on doing it, you know. I guess I've been doing it, but I like to. There's always a new song somewhere in there. Sure. You know, every day I talk to somebody, they go, hey, somebody will say something, somebody will say that. There's a song in there.
Okay, Peter, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to let you go. I'm just about running out of studio time here. But look, it's been an absolute treat to catch up with you. I could sit and listen to you for hours. I really could.
Well, I appreciate it, man. Stay in touch, please.
We'll do. And I'm glad your brand new phone held out all right for us.
Okay, man.
All the best.
We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.